Welcome to another episode of Let's Be Perfectly Queer. I've got an amazing guest with me this evening. He is the past chair of CAIDI, the Canadian AIDS Information Treatment Exchange, and the current co-chair of the Ontario AIDS Network, the OAN, which is also a board that I am pleasured to sit on. John McCullagh is with us today. He's also an accomplished writer, activist, and advocate for folks living with HIV here in Ontario and beyond. John, welcome to the show.
Thanks very much, Randy. Thanks for inviting me. It's good to be here.
I've wanted to have you as a guest for a while now, so I'm happy that you've accepted the invitation. So tonight we're talking about the new limited-run British series that has just been released here in Canada called It's a Sin. It depicts a decade between 81 and 1991, which essentially is the beginning or the dawn of the HIV/AIDS epidemic that is still going on. I'm going to start, John, by asking what it looked like for you back in those days. In 81 to 91, what did the life of John McCullagh look like?
Well, I would say remarkably like the young men in It's a Sin. I mean, as you can tell from my accent, It's a Sin is a British series, and I'm British. I was born and grew up in London, England, so I'm very familiar with the cultural context there. But I was in Canada. I've been in Canada since 1975. So I lived in Toronto right through throughout the AIDS epidemic. And I must say, It's a Sin is a very sad and very moving story, but also a story of resilience and vibrancy and fun and enjoyment. And that's how I tend to remember those early days, quite frankly, Randy. I think of my parents, and my parents are both dead, and I remember their deaths very vividly, but that's not what I really remember now. What I remember are the fun times we had together, and how great it was to go back over to the UK to visit them, when I was living here in Canada. And that's the kind of way that I tend to, and that's what I like about It's a Sin, because it talks about the fun and the vibrancy and the joyful of life in those days. And, these were young men who were escaping from mostly closeted homes, that nobody knew that they were gay. They came to London to kind of find themselves and to enjoy themselves and to start new lives. And, they came out at a time when there was, this new virus that was hitting the world, which they knew nothing about. These young guys, I was in my 30s at the time, so I'm much older than them, but they were, the kind of nights they had. I remember I had to, there wasn't a Friday and a Saturday night here in Toronto that I didn't go out to the bars, to the clubs, to dance and to enjoy myself with friends. And sometimes, we had too much alcohol, and sometimes we made stupid decisions, just like the boys in the movie, in the series did. But that's really all part of life. I guess the other thing, like, I've always been an activist, but not most people are not activists, right? And so I think we have to recognize that not everybody can come out of the closet and, like you and me, Randy, have a life of activism. Most people just get on with their lives. And I think when AIDS struck, most people didn't go on marches. They didn't protest. They were just scared. And they tried to not think about it, to avoid thinking about it.
1981, I was 15 years old. So I was just, starting high school and starting to explore my sexuality and what that meant for me. And it was, I've often said this when I've talked about It's a Sin to other individuals. When I first saw it, I look at it through a much different lens than someone like yourself, for example, because at that time I was very, very deeply closeted. And the idea of AIDS and HIV, I think, really helped to keep me closeted as long as it did. That fear you just talked about didn't allow me to come out and be my authentic self or become the activist that I am today, which, unlike you, I'm going into, I think, year 4 of what I would consider any sort of activism or advocacy work. And I didn't come out as gay until I was 38. So I think that's one of the things that I find most interesting when talking to folks about It's a Sin and reading reviews is the varied perspectives that folks have, because it's all based on their own experiences. Much like Russell T Davies, who created and wrote this series. I think a lot of folks forget that it focuses on a gay cisgendered white man in the UK because that's who Russell T Davies is. And I think we have to respect that the lens that he sees things through and the stories that he tells are just through that, his lens. And I think that's something that a lot of folks that in the reviews I've read miss out on that perspective.
Yes. I mean, we live in a very diverse world, and people, it wasn't only white gay men who were getting HIV, of course. But that does tend to be the narrative. But luckily that is changing now, because HIV is still with us, and we'll talk about that a bit in a moment, I guess. But I'd just like to go back a little bit to some other aspect of It's a Sin. But what I was struck so much, I think, about what It's a Sin portrayed was how people disappeared. Like I remember would go to the bars here in Toronto, and in those days we all went to the bars. There's no internet, so you would have bar acquaintances, people you would only see in the bar on a Friday and Saturday, and you saw them week after week after week, and then they suddenly weren't there, and nobody knew where they were, and nobody said anything. There was this fear of kind of wondering what had happened, fear of talking about it, and of course. The other experience that I remember vividly, which was certainly shown in the first episode, of how, like I had friends who as the guy who dies in the first episode, who were in hospital and died alone because nobody would visit them. Who, when they were in the hospital, their food would be brought and left outside their door because the nurses wouldn't go in to give it to them. How they would dress up in what we now call PPE, which is necessary with COVID, but HIV wasn't a respiratory disease, so there's no need to have all that PPE, but everybody wore, including visitors, and that was very, very sad. And I think that what says to me is this series is as much about homophobia and stigma as it is about HIV, and unfortunately, while we've made great strides in terms of treating HIV in the lives of people living with HIV, and now so, as I am, are so different than they were in the 80s but unfortunately, HIV-related stigma remains. And sadly, being a member of the gay community, I think much of that stigma sadly comes from other gay men. It's very sad. So,
yeah, I think we've seen on more than one occasion examples of that, and I agree. It's certainly the stigma, which is the result of ignorance and fear that surrounds HIV. I think it seems to hurt even more when it does come from within the gay community, a community that has really, while it's true HIV can affect anyone, it has been more prevalent in gay men, and the idea that so much negativity and quite frankly hate towards folks living with HIV comes from within that community is very hurtful.
Yes, it certainly is. And so, I think all of us, in our personal lives and in our professional lives, those of us who work in HIV and in gay men's health, really need to address significantly. And so what I'm so pleased about It's a Sin. I mean, it's a British story about filmed by a British TV channel. But it does have a lot of relevance to us here in Canada, and I think what it's given us is as a springboard, an opportunity to talk about what HIV is like today. Because if you get an HIV diagnosis in 2021, your outlook is so different. You can, as long as you get diagnosed quickly and you get on treatment right away, you can live a long and healthy life. And basically, it's just one pill a day. But the stigma is there, so you have to deal with the stigma too. But I mean, the outlook for people diagnosed with HIV today is so different, and I think that's what this show gives us an opportunity to talk about, and perhaps we can talk about HIV today.
Yeah, and I think that's bang on. That's certainly what I find the most exciting about the idea of It's a Sin being released here in Canada. And while I agree, it's unfortunate that it isn't more widely available to folks who don't have access to a subscription service. I think at the very least, being able to talk about what it looks like to live with HIV today and share those stories. I've seen so many stories from long-term survivors that are starting now to share their stories from the early days of the epidemic that they hadn't shared in more than 30 years. And I think that's important, that we're hearing the history, but we're also seeing that. And let me just go back, because that's one of the things that struck me when I've watched the series twice now. And what struck me the very first time I watched the series, well, I thought it was brilliant and I was an absolute puddle and gutted at the end of watching the series. I thought the one element that was missing for me was there was nothing that indicated that anyone who actually contracted HIV back in the early days, there was nothing that indicated that anyone was going to live. And we've seen that that's not the case. You know, I respect so many individuals that I've had the opportunity to learn from and get to know, and in many cases now call my friends, who are long-term survivors, who were diagnosed back in that same decade, who are still with us, who are thriving, who are doing amazing things personally and within the sector. And that we don't hear in the series.
No,
I realize that from what I've read, originally this was supposed to be an 8-episode arc of series, not just 5, and whether those additional 3 episodes that we didn't get to see would have progressed into those conversations as well. I think it's important that we have those conversations today as a result, and as you say, as a springboard from this series. So to not only show what it means to live with HIV today, but to show that there are still, air quote, success stories of folks who survived.
Yes, well, that's true, and it's too bad that the series, for financial reasons, I believe, was cut to 5 episodes, which is an odd length per series. But I did hear an interview with Russell Davies where he said he wanted to go back to the home of Colin, the parents of Colin, one of the young men in the series, and actually film it today and talk about the kind of thing that we're talking about, how HIV is different today. I also would like to say is that all of us in the gay community, particularly, whether we were diagnosed with HIV then or later, or not diagnosed at all, but lived through that era, you know, we're all survivors in a way. I mean, I don't want to take away from those living long term with HIV and the challenges they faced. But I mean, everybody of my generation, certainly, who are gay men and lived through that, whether they were diagnosed with HIV or managed to say HIV negative, everyone is a survivor of that era. It's a traumatic time for all gay men, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And I think that trauma and that resilience and survival has come about because we, as you so eloquently talked about, that all relates back to homophobia and the stigma that we not only face as folks living with HIV, but as queer individuals. I mean, there's stigma that just comes with being queer, you know, period, end of sentence.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So what are your hopes then, John, from this series? I mean, I think my hope is that with the success that this series is seeing, that maybe there will be then some injection of funds to allow Russell T Davies to explore those aspects beyond 1991 and give us another limited run series next year. It's a Sin Part 2 that maybe will get us closer to what it looks like today. What are your thoughts as to where we should be going with this conversation?
Well, it'd be great to have another series, but I think that won't happen anytime soon. But I think it does give us an opportunity, all of us, whether we are activists and people who work in HIV, like both of you and I do, Randy, or whether just for anybody these days to use this as an opportunity to talk about HIV, to smash the silence, because I think that's one of the things that's concerned. And I think the thing about HIV and HIV stigma arises out of fear, and everybody's terrified of getting HIV because if people remember the 80s, they will remember what it was like then. People who are younger and don't remember that have lived with the stories, and they've grown up with this kind of fear. And the reality is that now, with the advances we've made in medical treatment, somebody who is diagnosed with HIV, who goes on treatment, which essentially for most of us these days means one pill taken once a day, with or without food, with minimal or no side effects. It's like taking a multivitamin tablet. That's the way I think of it. You can live a long and healthy, productive life, a full life, and you're going to be healthy. And I think that is something that we need to shout from the rooftops, because that then. So I think it's the fear too of HIV, and the fear of an HIV diagnosis is what stops people going to get an HIV test. And I think every gay man who's sexually active should have an HIV test regularly, because if you do by any chance contract HIV, you can get treatment right away and your life will continue as normal. But if you don't get treatment, if you don't know you're living with HIV because you haven't gone to have a test, then HIV will continue, the virus will continue to multiply in your body, and eventually you will contract a stage of the infection, the virus will infect you in the way it did people in the 80s. That what doesn't happen anymore, rarely happens in Canada. So I would really advocate that every gay man who's sexually active gets tested regularly.
I'd even go a step beyond that and recommend anyone who is sexually active should get an HIV test regularly. And maybe you can talk to us a little bit about what testing looks like now, and access to testing and treatment. Because I know, and you're better at the numbers than I am, but we're like 62,000 roughly folks in Canada living with HIV, and of those 62,000, roughly 14% aren't aware that they're living with HIV?
That is correct. It's about 14% of people are not living with HIV but are not aware of it. That's what the modeling suggests. So getting an HIV test now is actually very straightforward. I mean, you can get your results in 5 minutes. When I had my first HIV test, it took 3 weeks to get the results. And you can imagine my fear and anxiety at a time before there was effective treatment, what that was like. Now you can get it's a finger prick, which draws a finger prick of blood, and it's mixed in a solution, and you can get your result in 5 minutes or less. You can have that test done in your doctor's office, or you can have that test done in a clinic. And recently, Health Canada has approved the use of home testers, HIV tests you can buy from the pharmacist and do at home. I'm not sure it's actually widely available in pharmacies at the moment, but it's on its way, certainly. So getting an HIV test is not scary. You get the results right away. And as I say, if it does turn out that you do have a positive diagnosis, then you can be linked to care and get on treatment right away. But the other thing I want to say about living with HIV today, and this is remarkable, is that we now know definitively that if you are on effective treatment, which means that if you take your medication as prescribed by your doctor regularly, that you cannot pass on HIV to those you have sex with. That is absolutely amazing, because the fear, I think, of HIV and of having sex with people with HIV has always been that we are seen, those of us living with HIV, used to be seen as vectors of disease from whom the public had to be protected, which is why we have these horrendous criminalization laws of people living with HIV who don't disclose their status. I mean, that's changing slowly, but the reality is that I am I have an undetectable viral load, which means I have so little virus in my blood because of the medication I'm taking. It can't be detected by blood tests. And we know now that somebody with an undetectable viral load cannot pass on HIV to their sexual partners, which, so I'm the safest person you can have sex with, at least in terms of safe from HIV.
Absolutely.
People we need to reach are the undiagnosed, the people who have HIV who don't know it, who, without realizing it, are passing on the virus to those they have sex with.
Yeah, I agree 100%. And I think that's one of the disappointments, I guess, with It's a Sin, is the fact that it isn't more widely released so that the general public who has access to just regular cable TV would actually be able to see this series. And that, I think, just only reinforces the importance of these conversations and shows like this that will be posted online for anyone to have access to while they might not be able to see the series. And I don't want to give spoilers away for folks who haven't had an opportunity to watch it yet. I think having these conversations and talking about HIV and what it looks like today and what it means to be undetectable and that you can't pass it on. I often say that as well, that when you're worried about safer sex, yeah, someone who is living with HIV and undetectable, who is sexually active, is your best bet. They are your safest bet because myself, for example, when I get tested every 3 to 6 months to confirm that I'm still have a suppressed viral load and undetectable, I also get tested for every other STI under the planet as well. I mean, I'm there and they're drawing blood anyway. Why not? Right. And I think that the more people who are willing to share those stories and come forth and say, this is the reality of HIV in 2021, then that message will hopefully get beyond the preaching to the choir that we often, unfortunately, seem to be doing within the sector.
Right. I think the other challenge that faces us today is that we have barriers to quality healthcare. So many people experience barriers to quality healthcare, and that comes out of racism and the lack of access to what we call the social determinants of health. In other words, adequate housing, adequate food, employment. Yeah. So that there are many people who also experience barriers to accessing healthcare because of the kind of treatment they have experienced in the past. I mean, as gay men, we've experienced that. But I think gay men have many intersectionalities, and there are many people who are not gay men who also could potentially be at risk for HIV. And so many of us, because of racism, of homophobia, of transphobia, and all kinds of other poverty, actually feel discriminated against or inadequately served when they access health services. So, it's really important not to think that everything is easy now. You just take one pill a day and away you go. I mean, that is true at some level, but at the other level, so many of us still have barriers to accessing quality healthcare, and we really need to fight against that and the discrimination that can often come with that. We all know that you go and if you went to get an HIV test and the tester kind of wagged their finger at you and said, you were here 2 weeks ago for this test and we treated you and now you're back again. You give that message to somebody once, you're never going to go back again. Why would you go back again and face that kind of discrimination? So those are some of the challenges, even within the system itself. Those of us who work in the system, who are healthcare providers and social workers, we need to think very carefully how we talk with service users.
And I guess my question would be how do we bring about that change? How do we instill in healthcare providers and decision makers around public health the importance of this information. I mean, we have all the tools in the toolbox, really, to be able to end the epidemic in Canada.
We do.
How do we get the political will behind us to help ensure that we do have universal access to treatment and care for folks and access to testing? How do we make that a reality, John?
It's very tough. I mean, I think education is one thing, but I think, those of us who I mean, we all vote. We all have a vote. Some of us have privilege that we can, like you and I, Randy, who can sit at tables and we can help to make decisions. But I think that basically we have to make sure we have the political will to do those things. And I think education is important as well. Because yes, we do have the tools to end the epidemic. It's political will, so that's going to be needed to make that happen.
Absolutely. As is always the case when I'm speaking to someone who I not only respect but look to as a mentor, like I do with you, my time is never enough. So I'm just going to ask you for final thoughts on It's a Sin and the trajectory of the series and what it means for those of us who are trying to create these conversations today.
Well, I think, first of all, for me, It's a Sin really honors the memory of the early heroes in the fight against HIV. It reminds us of our history. It's always important that we remember our history because we can learn lessons from history. I think there are many lessons from the HIV epidemic that can be used today in the pandemic of COVID. But I think the message now with respect to HIV is that is to get tested regularly, that if you test positive, to remember that you can live a long and healthy life if you get on treatment right away, and that you won't pass on HIV to your sexual partners. And if you're HIV negative and you're having a rich and full sex life, there's now a pill to prevent HIV called PrEP, pre-exposure prophylaxis.
Absolutely.
And you can take that on a daily basis, just like I take. It's the same medication. It's similar, not a different combination, but basically it's a HIV medication that I take and that negative people can take. And that will give you up to 99% assurance that you won't get HIV from the person.
Absolutely. I'm glad you brought that into the conversation, John. Thank you very much for your insights and your expertise and sharing some of your story with us tonight. I really do appreciate it. I hope we'll maybe have an opportunity to get you back on the show again soon. But in the meantime, that's it. Tune in next week for another episode of Let's Be Perfectly Queer.